most of you know who I am from various roles in the school. I've got no idea how long this is going to take, so I would appreciate your 6 minute marker. Yeah, thank you. Right, so as you know, the project is about code, this term code. It's called Decoding the City. Reclaiming Spatial Production is the kind of subtitle, which is important, and hopefully I'll explain what that means. I'm just going to whiz through these 4 things today: the theme, where it is, a bit of inspiration for the theme, and then some principles of how it will work. We'll start with a quote, get the theory out of the way. So Foucault's problem, one of them, was essentially the definition of the implicit systems in confinement of those prisoners. And what he would like to grasp is the system of limits and exclusion which we practice without knowing it, to make cultural unconscious apparent. So there's a few key bits in that you can probably draw out. Where he says which we practice without knowing it, I think that is relevant for users and citizens of space and architecture. But there's also another element that I want to explore, which is the things that we do know about. So as architects, the limits and exclusions that we know about, like building regulations and some of the codes that actually we do consciously as well as unconsciously. So the studio is going to be about challenging the regulation of the production of space and architecture. It's about the citizen's right to the city, which is quite a big notion that's been explored in lots of different disciplines, which we'll look into. It's about citizens' right to intervene in the built environment, in cities and their production, in terms of making space, making a claim to space that's already there, occupying space, making buildings, and so on. So it's going to be about tactics, different tactics that people use to do this. So it uses codes as a way to do it. We're going to explore codes, we're going to explore what that actually means, what are codes, what kind of codes. And we're going to do it by lots of different means of exploring codes. We're going to try and understand them better, not just reject them. It isn't just about figuring out lots of codes and then saying, oh, well, they're problematic. Some of them are, some of them aren't. So we're just going to understand them better. We're going to make them explicit, we're going to reveal them, so show things that are kind of assumed, but actually there's something behind it. We're going to subvert them, twist them, ignore them sometimes, as I think we probably do a lot. Exceed them, push their boundaries, and sometimes amplify them, exaggerate them. So that's what decoding is going to be, that's where the decoding kind of comes from. It's breaking them down and seeing what can be done to do things differently, to reclaim spatial production. So there's different types of code that I'll just very briefly kind of just throw a few random images of. So there's some codes that tell you what not to do, this kind of stuff, yeah? Particularly like the kind of not spitting one or not being sick one. This is actually in our project not a real sign, but it's kind of a comment on this kind of signage, which is like, you know, you can't do this, you can't do this, don't play with balls, don't sort of sit on the grass, don't do all this stuff. This was a little project that Blueprint magazine did a few years ago, where they actually sent out some of their staff to kind of test some of these codes and regulations in public space. So they'd sit and have a little picnic in this highly controlled environment and wait until the authorities came along, as they obviously did. So we look at some of these precedents of people subverting things. It's a little bit fuzzy that, but we have kind of different levels of these regulations happening. So we have things like design codes, which determine what architects do, and this is the Sheffield material palette zones. So we have a primary one, which is the red intense bit in the city centre where you can only use stone, and then different ones as you get further down. Then there's another kind of code that we're going to look at, which is codes that actually kind of inform what you do, not what you don't do. This is a thing called the nickname of a shotgun house, and it's the form of it in America, in New Orleans, comes from the way that the taxes are worked out, and that it's cheap. That basically the more rooms you have, the more tax you pay. So they've developed this kind of very long kind of vernacular, which you can fire a shotgun from one end to the other. So it's kind of got this name, the shotgun house. This is informal. This is an old map of 10 sort of plots next to the Mississippi River, and again it was on frontage because the trade was running up the river. The tax was worked out in terms of the width of your frontage, so very narrow, but as long as So economic factors come in. So there's some sort of spatial, obviously spatial codes, but there's other kind of codes. There's cultural codes, sort of commercialization, advertising, and so on, that sort of induce us into kind of using the city in particular ways, i.e. shopping. And then there's kind of cultural codes that kind of cross over with architecture and urbanism, so we get kind of these particular languages of urbanism and regeneration, like the creative city, which is kind of very common. So we'll be mapping these codes as the first phase. We'll be looking at them and trying to look at the different socio-cultural codes, ecological codes, economic codes, and so on. We'll also be looking, though, very closely at the codes that actually determine what you do as architects and trying to think that through. So being very critical about how you work, how you approach practice, and how you approach your projects. Yeah. You can do that at the end, Sam. So we're going to ask what actually happens if you decode spatial production and architecture. What happens if you take those things that we understand and that we know and break it down and then reformulate it somehow? If you take something like the codes of musical notation and radically alter them, what do you get? So what is a broken code? What does it generate? What does it give you? Does a new code have to emerge out of the other side of it or not, or could it be something else? So we'll explore some of these ideas. And I also want to ask about the politics of coding as well. So who actually codes? This is about going back to the right of the city. So we'll be in London. We'll be at a place called Hackney Wick, which you might know, East London. The big blue fence around the Olympic site is very important because it just sits next to it. Hackney Wick's gone through a lot of change over the last few years and is currently right in the middle of very much of a transition. It's very kind of open in some ways to kind of other things going on. So there's lots of artists were traditionally there, but they've kind of been moved on. So this kind of image of the kind of old warehouses being used for art and then the new developments coming in. There's lots of street markets and things like that. So it's quite a place that sort of is willing to accept this sort of redefinition of what things might be, but at the same time is under a lot of scrutiny at the moment. So just a bit of a map of it. Hackney Central is over there on the left. We've got central London to the sort of southwest. This is the Olympic Legacy Park, which is important for us because of everything that's going to go on afterwards, of course. And Hackney Wick's this area in the middle. There's a canal running through it. So it's a very interesting kind of urban and infrastructural situation. This is what's kind of coming, though. This is a lot of the current regeneration strategies that are going on. What I was showing before about that creative living idea, there's lots of this sort of very stuff that you can imagine. So it's a hub, it's creative industries, it's educate, live, work, all of this stuff that we can actually start to be very critical of through this decoding process. Right, a few quick bits of inspiration. Examples of sort of decoding going on in other disciplines. This was an art project in New York where it was about decoding advertising, so lots of blank speech bubbles were just stuck around and lots of adverts, and people could come along and write that bit in. So it was kind of like a decoding of advertising. This is an art project which is about reclaiming the street. So this is actually a tent people can sleep in. It looks like a car, so you get away with it. This was an intervention to... This bench was designed so that people couldn't sleep on it. So you can now. Just fit on it. This is a practice in Spain called Urbanas Recetas, which is another inspiration. So there's a few examples here of really architecturally taking these codes. This is about... you can get a license to basically have a skip in public space. So let's make a skip out of MDF ply and then do whatever you like on top of it. And you couldn't put the seesaw there without the skip. Sort of thing. Right, that should be okay. This one was about empty lots and negotiating a license to be able to use the lot. This is about you can put scaffolding up. So if you want a balcony, just apply to put scaffolding up, and you get a balcony. Okay. Right, but more than those things, Studio 15 is going to be much more ambitious than that. It's going to be a much bigger scale. It's not going to be about just small interventions. There might be some in the first semester, but it's about more than that. So, concerned with urban spatial production, so we'll be continuously making things, making drawings, making models, making propositions at all the different scales. The macro scale, the sort of building for infrastructure on meso scale, and right down to the detail, right from the beginning. So it's all about production. We understand architecture not just as theory or practice, buildings or research. It's both. It's everything together. It's a coordinated approach. So we're looking at spatial configurations, buildings, processes, relationships. And political, social, economic and cultural forces will come in and we'll question the role of the architect. The last thing I want to just finish on is a bit about this idea of assemblage, which we'll use to kind of structure the year and do actual production. And assemblages are, they're a bit like a system in a way, but they're a little bit more than a system as well. So it's about these things. It's about the component parts. It's about their relationships, static and dynamic relationships. But it's also about the effects that they have on different registers, on themselves as a kind of a system, but also on the people that use them and on other things. So we'll be looking at these kind of assemblages, spatial assemblages across the whole project, of use and so on, but then material assemblages, so systems of construction. Why do you use particular material in the configuration? And then also social assemblages, and obviously their interrelationship. So that'll work at all scales and at all levels, across the year. Okay, thank you.